There are questions that live in the architecture of a relationship, silent load-bearing structures that you never notice until one of them is spoken aloud. For 4 years, the unspoken question between Julian and me was a quiet, cavernous space we both navigated with careful, unconscious steps. It was the room in our shared house of friendship that we never entered. We knew it was there, I think. I certainly did. It was the room where my feelings for him were stored, cataloged, and gathering dust, a museum of a love I was too terrified to display. I lived with the silence of it, learned its language, its weight, its particular shape in the dark. And then, one Tuesday night, with the rain slicking the windows into a blurry watercolor of city lights, Julian walked right into that room, turned on the light, and asked a question so simple it threatened to demolish everything. He was lying on my couch, a familiar tableau, his long frame folded into the worn cushions, head pillowed on my thigh. We'd been watching some meaningless documentary about deep-sea life, and the narrator's voice had lulled him into that soft state between waking and sleeping. His own voice, when it came, was thick with it, a low murmur against the fabric of my jeans. "Leo," I hummed in response, my eyes still on the screen where a translucent squid was pulsing with bioluminescent light. My entire world had shrunk to the point of contact between us, the warmth of his cheek seeping through the denim, the gentle weight of his head a profound and painful anchor. "Why don't you ever call first?" The question landed in the quiet apartment with the force of a dropped stone in a still pond. The ripples spread through me instantly, a cold shock of adrenaline and confusion. I looked down at him. His eyes were closed, his dark lashes stark against his skin. He looked peaceful, but the question was anything but. It was an excavation, a demand for a map to a territory I had deliberately left uncharted. Because the answer was the most dangerous thing I knew. I never called first because the sheer, unbridled hope that he might call me was one of the few things that got me through the week. I never called first because if I did, I would have to consciously manage the yearning in my voice, to pitch it at the perfect, casual frequency of friend, when all I wanted to do was broadcast my heart on every channel. I never called first because I was a quiet observer, a photographer who lived behind a lens, and initiating felt like stepping in front of it, exposed and vulnerable and horribly lit. I never called first because I was terrified that one day he just wouldn't answer. "I don't know," I said, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. "You're always busy. I figure you'll call when you have time." He shifted slightly, a soft exhalation that was almost a sigh. The air in the room felt thick, charged with the energy of something breaking its long-held pattern. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough for me to think he'd fallen asleep, long enough for my heart to beat a frantic, panicked rhythm against my ribs. Then he spoke again, his voice even quieter than before, a confession whispered into the space between us. "I wish you would," and that was it. That was the moment the foundations shuddered. He wished I would. Two simple words that took the silent, dusty room of my affection and blew a window straight through its wall, letting in a terrifying, brilliant, and utterly blinding light. I didn't know then that this was the beginning of the end of our comfortable silence, the first tremor of an earthquake that would either bring our world crashing down or settle the landscape into a shape I had only ever allowed myself to dream of. All I knew was the weight of his head on my leg, the sound of the rain, and the deafening echo of a wish that sounded dangerously like my own. To understand the weight of that wish, you'd have to understand the foundation it landed on. Our friendship was, from its inception, an unlikely piece of architecture. We met in college, assigned as random roommates in a dorm that smelled perpetually of damp towels and burnt popcorn. Julian was everything I was not. He was a swimmer, a creature of kinetic energy and easygoing charm, his life a series of disciplined, powerful strokes that propelled him forward with a confidence I could only envy. His side of the room was a controlled explosion of team hoodies, textbooks piled in precarious towers, and a rotating cast of friends who flowed in and out like a constant, cheerful tide. He moved through the world as if it were his native element, buoyant and sure. I, on the other hand, was a quiet art student, majoring in photography, a discipline built on stillness, on waiting for the right light, the perfect composition. My side of the room was a study in quiet order, my camera equipment laid out like surgical tools, my books alphabetized, my space a carefully constructed fortress against the chaos of communal living. I moved through the world as if I were visiting a foreign country, cautious and observant, always trying to learn the local language without ever speaking it. I was convinced we would last a semester before one of us requested a transfer. He was too loud, too bright, too much. I was too quiet, too contained, too little. But Julian, in his infinite and baffling capacity for connection, saw no such divide. He saw a boundary and simply stepped over it, not with force, but with an unassuming warmth that was impossible to repel. He'd come back from a grueling morning practice, smelling of chlorine and exhaustion, and instead of collapsing onto his own bed, he'd perch on the edge of mine and ask to see the photos I'd been editing. He didn't just glance at them. He looked. He'd point to a shot of a rain-slicked street and talk about the way I'd captured the loneliness of the reflection, or he'd study a portrait and ask about the person, what they were thinking in that exact moment. He saw the story in my stillness, and in turn, I began to see the quiet depths beneath his constant motion. My feelings for him didn't arrive in a sudden, crashing wave. They were a slow tide, rising incrementally over months and years, so gradually that I was submerged before I even realized I had waded into the water. It was in the small moments. It was the way he'd fall asleep studying, his face pressed into a textbook, and I'd feel an overwhelming urge to drape a blanket over his shoulders. It was the way his laugh could fill our entire apartment, a sound so genuine and unburdened it felt like a physical warmth. It was the time I got a nasty flu and he skipped a party, a legendary one, I later heard, to sit with me, forcing me to drink electrolyte solution and changing the cold cloth on my forehead until my fever broke. He never made a big deal of it. It was just what you did. For him, it was simple friendship. For me, it was evidence, another piece of a mosaic I was assembling in secret, a portrait of a man I was irrevocably, hopelessly falling in love with. I hid it, of course. I buried it under layers of casual banter and easy camaraderie. I became an expert in the art of platonic affection, mastering the precise pressure of a friendly shoulder clap, the exact duration of a celebratory hug. My camera became my shield and my confessional. I had hundreds of photos of him that no one else ever saw. Julian sleeping, his face unguarded and soft. Julian mid-laugh, head thrown back, a picture of pure joy. Julian staring out a window, a rare moment of pensive stillness where the weight of his own world seemed to settle on his broad shoulders. Through my lens, I could love him without risk. I could frame my adoration, crop out the impossibility of it, and keep it safe in the quiet, digital darkness of an external hard drive. Our friendship was the most stable, most important structure in my life, and I would sooner burn my own house down than risk damaging a single beam of it. So I learned to live in that silent room, content, or so I told myself, just to be in the house at all. After graduation, we moved into a 2-bedroom apartment on the other side of the city. He got a demanding job as a consultant, a role that suited his energy and charisma, while I started a freelance photography business, a career that sanctified my role as the observer. The dynamic remained the same. His life was a whirlwind of deadlines, travel, and a social life that often left him drained. My life was a rhythm of quiet shoots, solitary hours in the darkroom or in front of a screen, and the patient waiting for the next job. Our apartment became his sanctuary, and I, by extension, became a part of that. He had a string of girlfriends, women who were bright and beautiful and who, for a time, would become a part of our ecosystem. I was always friendly, always welcoming, and always felt a quiet, hollow ache watching him love them. I'd see him hold their hand with an easy intimacy that he reserved for them, and I would have to physically stop my own hand from clenching into a fist in my pocket. But none of them lasted. There was always some fundamental disconnect, some way in which their energy didn't quite mesh with the restless, deeper currents that ran beneath Julian's sunny surface. And after each breakup, He would retreat back to the quiet center of our friendship, and I would be there, the constant, the lighthouse keeper making sure the light never went out, even as my own heart was weathering a private storm. The shift, the real, tectonic shift, began the night he broke up with Sarah. She was the most serious of them all, a relationship that had spanned nearly 2 years. I had genuinely thought she might be the one. She seemed to understand him, to tolerate his insane work schedule and his need for quiet decompression. I had even begun the painful process of trying to accept it, to relegate my feelings to a permanent, sealed-off wing of my internal museum. Then, one Thursday evening, Julian came home looking like a building that had been hollowed out by fire. He didn't speak. He just walked into the living room, dropped his keys on the coffee table with a clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the silence, and sank onto the couch. He stared at the blank television screen for a full 10 minutes before I dared to break the spell. "Jules?" I asked softly from the doorway. He looked over at me, and his eyes were wrecked. The usual light in them was gone, replaced by a dull, exhausted grief. "She's gone," he said, his voice a raw whisper. "She packed her things this afternoon. Said she couldn't do it anymore. Said it felt like she was always waiting for me to really let her in. Like there was a part of me I was holding back." He let out a dry, humorless laugh. "She said it felt like I was already home with someone else." The irony was so bitter, so profoundly painful, that I almost choked on it. He was home, and I was there. But it wasn't what she thought. It wasn't what I wished it was. He was mistaking the comfort of our friendship, the safety of our shared space, for a connection that could sustain him. And in that moment, seeing the genuine devastation on his face, my own selfish ache was overwhelmed by a tidal wave of empathy. I crossed the room and sat down next to him, not touching him, just closing the distance. For hours, we sat in the deepening twilight as he talked, really talked, for the first time about his fears. He talked about feeling like he was always performing, always having to be the energetic, confident guy everyone expected. He talked about the crushing loneliness that would hit him on business trips, in hotel rooms that all looked the same. He talked about a deep, abiding exhaustion that his relentless motion was designed to keep at bay. "With you," he said, finally turning to look at me, his gaze so direct and vulnerable it felt like a physical touch. "I don't have to be anything. I can just stop. It's the only place I can stop." That night, he fell asleep on the couch, his head eventually slumping onto my shoulder. I didn't move for hours, my muscles screaming in protest, my arm going numb, because I was terrified of breaking the spell. It was the first time he had sought physical comfort from me with such unambiguous need. It wasn't a casual, half-joking lean during a movie. This was a deliberate anchoring. He was a ship battered by a storm, and he had thrown his line to my shore. I didn't know then, sitting in the dark with the weight of his sleeping form against me, that he had just ceded a piece of territory, that a border had been crossed. He had let me into a place of his vulnerability he had never shown anyone else, and in doing so, he had unknowingly started a ritual that would come to define our lives for the next 6 months. The ritual began subtly, as most profound changes do. It started with movie nights. Before the breakup, we'd watch films from opposite ends of the couch, a respectable cushion of air between us, our shared space defined by the coffee table and its clutter of bowls and glasses. After Sarah, that space began to shrink. It began the week after she left. Julian came home from work, looking gray with fatigue, and simply announced, "I can't be alone in my room." Movie. We settled on the couch, and within 20 minutes, he had shifted, his body slowly closing the gap until his shoulder was pressed against mine. An hour in, his head was resting on my shoulder, his breathing evening out into the soft cadence of sleep. I sat there, rigid with a mixture of pure, unadulterated bliss and sheer, heart-stopping panic. Every nerve ending in my body was on fire, hyper-aware of the pressure of his temple against my neck, the scent of his shampoo, the faint warmth of his breath. It was an exquisite torture. I was a starving man presented with a feast he was forbidden to eat. The first few times, I told myself it was nothing. He was grieving. He was exhausted. He was seeking the simple, uncomplicated comfort of a friend. I was a safe harbor, nothing more. My mind, the logical, self-protective part of it, worked overtime to build a narrative of platonic necessity around these moments. It constructed a fortress of plausible deniability, walling off the part of my heart that was screaming with a dangerous, untamable hope. But the ritual began to repeat, then escalate. The couch became our default setting for the evenings. He'd come home, drop his bag, and gravitate towards me, as if pulled by an invisible current. The pretense of watching a movie often dissolved within minutes. The television would provide a flickering, ambient light for what was really happening, him finding a place to rest, and me providing it. Then came the nights he started staying in my room. It began one Friday, after we'd gone out with some of his work colleagues. He'd had more to drink than usual, trying to keep up the facade of the cheerful, untroubled guy. When we got home, he stumbled towards his own bedroom, then paused in the hallway, his hand on the doorknob. His room was still half empty, a space haunted by the ghost of Sarah's presence. He hadn't had the heart to change it yet. He turned back to me, his eyes clouded with alcohol and something deeper, something that looked like a child's fear of the dark. "Can I?" He didn't finish the sentence. He just gestured vaguely towards my room at the other end of the hall. "Your room doesn't feel so big." My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic prisoner. This was a new threshold, a door I wasn't sure I was ready to open. But the look on his face, the raw plea in it, dismantled all my defenses. I gave a small, tight nod. "Sure." I managed, my voice sounding unnaturally high. "The floor is yours." He offered a weak, grateful smile and followed me. But he didn't take the floor. After I had climbed into my bed and turned off the light, I heard him moving in the darkness. Then, a hesitation, and the mattress dipped beside me. He lay on top of the covers, on the very edge of the queen-sized bed, his back to me, keeping as much distance as the space would allow. But he was there, in my bed. The air was thick with unspoken things, with the scent of beer and the cold night air clinging to his clothes. I lay awake for hours, listening to him breathe, every nerve a live wire. I was acutely aware of the inches of empty space between our bodies, a chasm that felt both impossibly vast and terrifyingly small. This, too, became part of the ritual. Not every night, but often enough to become a new, fragile norm. There was always a pretext. He'd worked a 16-hour day and was too tired to face his own empty room. He'd had a nightmare and didn't want to be alone. He claimed my mattress was better for his swimmer's back, a transparently flimsy excuse that we both tacitly agreed not to question. Each time, he would start on the far edge of the bed. But sleep is an unguarded country, and in its unconscious depths, the borders we so carefully patrol in our waking hours dissolve. I would wake in the middle of the night to find him turned towards me, an arm thrown across my chest, his leg tangled with mine. I would find his face buried in the curve of my shoulder, his soft, even breaths warming my skin. In those silent, pre-dawn hours, I would lie perfectly still, a statue carved from fear and longing, committing every detail to memory. The exact weight of his arm, the texture of his hair against my cheek, the way his body, even in sleep, seemed to seek out my warmth, my solidity. It was a secret, nocturnal intimacy that vanished with the first light of day. We would wake up, disentangle ourselves with a clumsy, unspoken haste, and never, ever acknowledge how we had ended up that way. My internal world during this period was a maelstrom. I was living a double life. In one, I was the stoic, reliable friend, a pillar of stability for a man weathering a storm. In the other, I was a man drowning in a sea of his own making, analyzing every touch, every sleepy murmur, every lingering glance for a meaning I was desperate to find. I was a detective searching for clues in a case where I was the only suspect. Did the way he held my gaze for a second too long this morning mean something? Was the pressure of his hand on my shoulder as he passed behind me in the kitchen intentional? Was I inventing it all? Was I a delusional architect drawing blueprints for a castle on a foundation of sand? The anxiety was a constant, low-grade hum beneath the surface of my days. I found it hard to concentrate on my work. The faces in my portraits all started to look like him. The landscapes I shot seemed to echo the contours of our shared silence. He seemed completely oblivious to my turmoil, or perhaps he was simply a master of denial. He moved through this new landscape of blurred lines with a sleepwalker's confidence, never questioning the path, never looking down. He initiated every step of this strange, intimate dance. He was the one who closed the distance on the couch, the one who appeared at my bedroom door, the one whose sleeping body migrated across the mattress to find mine. And I, the quiet observer, simply allowed it. I let him lead, because to do otherwise, to either stop him or, God forbid, to meet him halfway, would be to admit that this was something more than friendship. It would mean stepping out from behind my lens and risking the entire composition. And so we existed in this liminal space, this hallway between rooms, in a state of profound and intimate ambiguity. He was the unknowing initiator, and I was the silent accomplice, both of us complicit in a ritual whose purpose we refused to name. It was beautiful, it was agonizing, and I knew, with a certainty that terrified me, that it was utterly unsustainable. Something had to break. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday night, 6 months into the ritual. The same night, he asked me the question that started it all. The rain was a constant, drumming presence against the glass, isolating our apartment from the rest of the world, turning it into a hermetically sealed vessel of tension and unspoken feelings. He was on the couch, head on my lap, the documentary on the television a meaningless drone. After he'd whispered, "I wish you would," a new kind of silence fell between us, different from the comfortable quiet we were used to. This silence was active, a living thing, filled with the echoes of his words. It was a silence that demanded a response. My mind raced, trying to formulate an answer that was both honest and safe, an impossible contradiction. My heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of my chest. He must have sensed my panic, the sudden rigidity in my body. He pushed himself up, his movements slow and deliberate, and turned to face me. The cushions dipped with his weight, bringing us knee to knee. The television cast a flickering blue light across his face, carving shadows under his cheekbones and illuminating the earnest, searching look in his eyes. He wasn't sleepy anymore. He was wide awake, and he was looking at me, really looking, in a way that stripped away all my defenses. It was the look he usually reserved for my photographs, an intense, analytical gaze that sought the story beneath the surface. "Leo," he said, and my name was not a question but a statement. "A beginning. We need to talk." I could only nod, my throat too tight for words. My entire universe had contracted to the few feet of space between us on that worn couch. The deep-sea creatures on the screen swam on, oblivious. The rain continued its steady rhythm. But inside our small, sealed world, the pressure was building to an impossible degree. "This," he began, gesturing to the space between us, to the couch, to the whole apartment. "What we're doing, what is this?" His voice was low, laced with a confusion that mirrored my own. "For months, I come home, and all I want is to be here, with you. I fall asleep on you. I crawl into your bed like a lost kid. And I tell myself it's because I'm lonely, because I'm messed up after Sarah, because you're my best friend and you're safe." He shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. "But that's not it. Not all of it. It's more than that. I feel, I don't know, calm when I'm near you. Like the noise in my head finally stops." He paused, swallowing hard. I watched the vulnerability wash over his face, saw the fear in his eyes. He was stepping off a cliff, and he was terrified. And in that moment, my own fear receded, replaced by a profound, aching tenderness. He was trying, in his own fumbling, earnest way, to give a name to the ritual we had both been so afraid to define. "Last week," he continued, his voice barely a whisper, "I was in Chicago for work. I was in my hotel room, and I couldn't sleep. And I realized, I just missed this. I missed you. Not just talking to you. I missed your presence. Your quiet. I missed being able to just stop." He reached out then, his hand hesitating in the air for a fraction of a second before it came to rest on my knee. His touch was electric, a jolt that went straight to my core. His palm was warm, his grip gentle but firm. It was not a casual touch. It was an anchor, and I realized that I don't feel that way with anyone else. I never have. Not even with her. Every carefully constructed wall inside me began to crumble. The fortress of platonic friendship, the museum of secret love, all of it was turning to dust. He was saying the words, the terrifying, beautiful words that I had never dared to even hope for. But the fear was still there, a cold snake coiling in my gut. What if I was misinterpreting this? What if this was just a profound, but ultimately platonic, confession of need? And that's when I found my voice. It was shaky, fragile, but it was mine. So what are you asking, Julian? He looked at his hand on my knee, then back up to my face. The blue light from the television reflected in his eyes, making them look as deep and mysterious as the ocean on the screen. He was searching my face for something, permission or a warning. I couldn't tell. I'm asking, he said, his voice dropping even lower, so low I had to lean in to hear him over the rain. If this is okay, he squeezed my knee gently. If I'm okay. To feel this, the honesty of it, the raw vulnerability, broke me. It shattered the last of my fear. He wasn't asking me to define it for him. He was asking me to see him, to see the confused, tangled mess of his feelings and not turn away. He was giving me an opening, a door pushed slightly ajar, waiting to see if I would walk through it or close it gently in his face. All the years of silence, of observation, of hiding behind my camera, had led to this single moment of choice. I could retreat into the safety of our old friendship, offer some comforting, platonic words, and spend the rest of my life wondering. Or I could take the biggest risk of my life. I raised my own hand, my movements feeling slow, surreal, as if moving through water. I placed it over his. Our fingers intertwined, a natural, perfect fit. I looked at our joined hands, this small point of contact that felt like the center of the entire world, and then I looked back at him. I let him see it all. I dropped the lens, stepped out from behind the camera, and let him see the 4 years of adoration, the months of agonizing hope, the lifetime of love I had held in reserve. I let him see it in my eyes. Yes, I whispered, the word a release, an exhalation I'd been holding for years. It's okay. A universe of emotion passed over his face in that 1 second. Relief, so profound it was like watching a man set down a burden he'd been carrying his whole life. Surprise, as if he was only just now realizing the truth of his own feelings. And then, something else. A quiet, tentative joy. He leaned in closer, his other hand coming up to cup my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek. His touch was feather-light, questioning. The world narrowed to the scent of rain on his jacket, the warmth of his skin, the sound of our breathing. Would it be okay? He breathed, his lips inches from mine. If I kissed you? He asked. After all the unspoken things, all the ambiguous gestures and sleepy confessions, he asked. He gave me the choice. He made sure the final, irreversible step was one we took together. Yes, I said again. And this time there was no hesitation, no fear. Just a deep, resonant certainty. And then he closed the final distance. His kiss was not passionate or demanding. It was a question, a discovery. It was soft and hesitant and deeply, deeply gentle. It tasted of rain and relief and the end of a very long silence. It was the sound of a door finally, quietly, clicking shut behind us, leaving us together in a room we had both been afraid to enter for far too long. It was a beginning, written in the language we had just, together, learned to speak. The aftermath of a kiss like that is not like the movies. There are no soaring orchestrations, no immediate, seamless transition into a new reality. There is, instead, a profound and terrifying silence. The world, which had narrowed to a single point of contact, rushes back in, loud and complicated. We pulled apart slowly, the space between us charged with a fragile, incandescent energy. We just looked at each other, our joined hands on my knee the only thing anchoring us. Julian's face was a canvas of unreadable emotions. The initial relief had been replaced by something else, something that looked unnervingly like panic. It was a flicker in his eyes, a tightening around his mouth. He had crossed the line. And now he was looking back at the safe territory he'd just left behind, suddenly unsure of the new ground beneath his feet. He pulled his hands away from mine, a small, almost imperceptible retreat, but I felt it like a physical blow. He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture I knew well, and wouldn't meet my eyes. He was looking at the television, at the wall, anywhere but at me. The beautiful, honest room we had just entered together suddenly felt cold, the walls closing in. The silence stretched, and with every second, the fragile joy of the kiss began to curdle into a familiar, sickening anxiety. I had misinterpreted everything. He had been caught up in a moment of vulnerable confusion, and I had let him, had encouraged him. The fault was mine. The hope that had bloomed in my chest moments before began to wither, its petals turning to ash. I should probably go to bed, he mumbled, finally standing up. He still wouldn't look at me. The words were a dismissal, a clear, sharp retreat. He needed space, distance. He needed to get away from me, from what we had just done. Julian, I started, but my voice was weak. I'm just really tired, he said, already moving towards the hallway. Long day. It was a lie, a flimsy shield, and we both knew it. He disappeared into his own room, and for the first time in 6 months, he closed the door. Not just closed it, but I heard the soft, definitive click of the latch engaging. The sound was a judgment, a final, crushing verdict. I was left alone on the couch, the echo of the kiss on my lips, the warmth of his touch fading from my skin. The rain was still falling, but it no longer felt like a comforting cocoon. It sounded like weeping. I had risked everything, and I had lost. The silence he left behind was not the silence of comfort or shared understanding. It was the silence of a void, of an irreparable crack in the foundation of everything I held dear. The days that followed were a special kind of hell. It was a cold war fought in the small territory of our apartment. Julian became a ghost. He left for work before I woke up and came home late, long after I had retreated to my own room. We communicated through brief, sterile text messages about bills or groceries. When we did cross paths in the hallway or the kitchen, the encounters were excruciating. He was all stilted politeness and averted eyes. He would ask me how my day was with the forced cheerfulness of a stranger, his body angled towards the exit, ready to flee. The easy physical affection that had defined our lives for months vanished completely. There were no more lingering touches, no more comfortable silences. The space between us was now a minefield, and we were both too afraid to take a single step. My heart fractured a little more with each awkward encounter. I oscillated wildly between a deep, wounded anger and a crushing sense of guilt. I was angry at him for initiating something he was clearly not ready for leading me to the edge of a cliff only to watch me fall. But I was also furious with myself. I had known he was vulnerable. I had known he was confused. I should have been the stable one, the friend. I should have protected him and our friendship from my own selfish desires. I replayed the kiss, the conversation leading up to it, over and over in my mind, dissecting every word, every look, searching for the exact moment where I had gone wrong. The ritual, which had been a source of such profound comfort and hope, now felt like a cruel deception, a dream that had left me with the bitter taste of its impossibility upon waking. After a week of this silent, agonizing torture, I knew I couldn't go on. The ambiguity was destroying me, and the ghost of our friendship was more painful than a clean break would be. I had to know. I needed to hear it from him, to have him articulate the rejection so I could finally begin the long, painful process of moving on. I needed him to close the door in my face so I would stop waiting by it. That night, I waited for him. I sat on the couch, the same couch where it had all happened, and watched the clock tick past midnight. When I finally heard his key in the lock, my stomach clenched into a tight, painful knot. He walked in, looking as exhausted as I felt. He stopped short when he saw me, his shoulders tensing. The hunted look was back in his eyes. "Hey," he said, his voice flat. "Didn't expect you to be up. We need to talk," I said, echoing his own words from a week ago. The symmetry was not lost on me. He sighed, a deep, weary sound, and dropped his bag by the door. He didn't come to the couch. He leaned against the opposite wall, creating the maximum possible distance between us in the small room. He crossed his arms over his chest, a defensive posture. He was bracing for impact. "Look, Leo, about the other night," he started, the words he had clearly been rehearsing all week. "I'm sorry. I was confused, and I was out of line. It was a mistake. Our friendship is too important to me to mess it up like that. Can we just forget it happened?" Forget it happened. The words were a dismissal of everything. Not just the kiss, but the months of intimacy, the sleepy confessions, the shared beds, the unspoken understanding. He wanted to erase it all, to pretend the ritual had meant nothing more than what he had told himself it meant, the simple comfort of a friend. And that, I realized with a sudden, clarifying surge of anger, was not something I was willing to accept. My hurt was still there, but it was now joined by a fierce, protective instinct, not for him, but for the truth of what we had shared. "No," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "It surprised both of us. I can't forget it happened. And I won't let you pretend it was just some mistake, because it wasn't." It was the end of a 6-month-long conversation we were having without words. He flinched, his defensive posture faltering. I stood up and took a step towards him, closing the distance he had so carefully created. "You don't get to do that, Julian," I continued, my voice gaining strength. "You don't get to lean on me, to sleep in my bed, to pull me into the most intimate parts of your life, and then run away the second it gets a name. You don't get to ask me for a kiss and then treat me like a stranger because it scared you. I deserve more than that. What we have, deserves more than that." I wasn't shouting. My voice was level, but it was filled with the weight of every unspoken feeling, every moment of hope and fear I had endured. I was finally stepping in front of the lens, demanding to be seen, not as a safe harbor or a convenient comfort, but as a person. His composure finally broke. The carefully constructed wall of nonchalance crumbled, and the raw fear and confusion I had seen on the night of the kiss returned, magnified. "I don't know what I'm doing, Leo," he burst out, his voice cracking. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were swimming with unshed tears. "Okay, I don't know what this is. I kiss you, and it felt right. It felt more right than anything has ever felt. And that terrifies me. Because what does that mean? Who am I? All my life, I've been this one thing. The swimmer, the consultant, Sarah's boyfriend. I had a map. I knew who I was supposed to be. And now this. You. It's like you've handed me a map to a country I didn't even know existed, and I don't know how to read it. I don't know how to be that person." He finally collapsed. All the energy, all the forward momentum that had defined his life, just gave out. He slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, his head in his hands. "I'm so scared," he whispered into his palms. "I'm scared of what this means. And I'm terrified of losing you. I thought if I just ignored it, if I pushed you away, I could put things back in the box. I could save our friendship. But it's just made everything worse. I miss you. I miss my best friend." The anger drained out of me, replaced by a wave of overwhelming empathy. I crossed the room and sank to the floor in front of him. I didn't touch him. I just sat there, knee to knee, just as we had been on the couch. I waited for him to look up. When he finally did, his face was a mess of shame and grief. "You can't lose me," I said softly. "You're stuck with me. But we can't go back to the way things were. That box is broken, Jules. We can't unsee this new map. But maybe we don't have to read it alone." I took a breath, preparing to take my own leap of faith, to confess my own truth without the buffer of a kiss. "I've been in love with you for years," I said, the words hanging in the air between us, simple and solid and undeniable. "So this map, it's not new to me. I've just been afraid to show it to you. But I'm not anymore. I'm scared too. But I'm more scared of going back to the silence." I reached out and gently pulled his hands away from his face. I held them in mine. "You don't have to have it all figured out," I said. "You don't have to be some new person overnight. You just have to be here, with me, and not run away." Tears finally spilled over and tracked down his cheeks. He gave a watery, shaky laugh. "God, you're so much braver than I am." "No," I said, squeezing his hands. "I've just had more practice at being scared." He leaned forward, resting his forehead against mine. We stayed like that for a long time, just breathing together on the floor of our hallway, two people in a country neither of us knew, holding the map together. The war was over. The silence was broken. And in its place, something new and fragile and incredibly, terrifyingly hopeful was beginning to grow. The resolution wasn't a single, cinematic moment of revelation. It was a slow, deliberate process of rebuilding, of learning a new language together. It was a series of quiet conversations that stretched late into the night, conversations where we laid all our fears and histories bare. Julian talked about the pressures he'd always felt to fit a certain mold of masculinity, the confusion he'd buried for years under a mountain of ambition and romantic relationships that never quite felt right. He admitted that his need for my presence, his gravitation towards my quiet, had always felt like something more than friendship, but it was a feeling so foreign to his self-concept that he'd had no framework to understand it. He had needed the safety of our ritual, the plausible deniability of it all, to allow himself to get close to the truth without having to confront it head-on. The kiss was the moment the truth had refused to be ignored any longer, and his fear had been a primal instinct to retreat to the familiar. I, in turn, talked about my years of silent adoration, about the fear of rejection that had kept me behind my camera, a perpetual observer of my own life. I confessed that his unknowing initiation of our intimacy had been both a dream come true and an exquisite form of torture. I admitted that my quietness wasn't just a personality trait, but a defense mechanism, a way to avoid risking the most important relationship in my life. We laid our cards on the table, all the hidden fears and unspoken desires, and we discovered that, beneath it all, we were both just terrified of losing the one person who made us feel truly seen. The confession of his fear and my confession of love became the new, honest foundation upon which we started to build. The change was in the small things, the deliberate acts of intimacy that replaced the ambiguous ones. The first time he reached for my hand as we walked down the street was a quiet revolution. There was no pretext, no confusion. It was a simple, public declaration that felt louder than a shout. The first morning I woke up to find him in my bed, not because he'd had a nightmare or was too tired, but because that's where he wanted to be, was a revelation. He was on his side of the bed, I was on mine, but the space between us was no longer a chasm of anxiety. It was a field of shared peace. He reached across it, his eyes still heavy with sleep, and laced his fingers through mine. No words were needed. The gesture said everything. The door to his bedroom remained open now, not as an invitation for a rescue, but as a symbol that there were no more barriers between us. But more often than not, we found ourselves behind my closed door, creating a new shared space that was intentionally ours. The couch, once the primary stage for our drama of ambiguity, became just a couch again. We still watched movies there, but now, when his head rested on my shoulder, it was not a desperate search for comfort, but a simple, contented expression of affection. I would rest my own head on top of his, and the peace I felt was no longer tinged with the metallic taste of fear. It was a solid, grounding presence, a peace I could finally, fully inhabit. One Saturday morning, about a month after our hallway confrontation, I woke up to the smell of coffee. I walked into the kitchen to find Julian standing at the counter, wearing one of my old t-shirts, carefully pouring hot water over coffee grounds in the Chemex I rarely used. He looked up and gave me a soft, sleepy smile that made my heart ache with a gentle, uncomplicated happiness. "Morning," he said. "Thought I'd try to make the fancy coffee for once." I came up behind him, wrapping my arms around his waist and resting my chin on his shoulder. He leaned back into me, his body warm and solid. I watched his steady hands as he finished pouring the water. It was a scene of such simple, profound domesticity that it almost brought me to tears. This was it. This was the new normal. Not a grand, sweeping romance, but this. The quiet comfort of a Saturday morning, the shared ritual of making coffee, the easy intimacy of a hug from behind. It was the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together a silence no longer filled with unspoken questions, but with unspoken understanding. He turned in my arms to face me, his hands coming up to cup my face. He looked at me with that same searching gaze he'd had on the couch that rainy night. But this time, there was no fear in it, no confusion. Only a deep, abiding affection that mirrored my own. "You know," he said softly, his thumb tracing my jawline. "You still haven't called me first." I laughed, a real, unburdened laugh. "I guess I don't have to anymore," I said. "You're already here," he smiled, a slow, brilliant smile that lit up his entire face. "I'm already here," he repeated, as if tasting the truth of the words. He leaned in and kissed me, a kiss that was no longer a question or a discovery, but a statement, a promise. It was a kiss that tasted like coffee and home. We learned to communicate in the spaces between our words, in the subtle language of gesture and proximity. We build entire worlds in the silences we share with the people we love. For years, Julian and I spoke a language of careful distance and unspoken rules, a dialogue of friendship designed to protect us from a truth we weren't ready to face. Then, we learned a new language, one of ambiguous comfort and plausible deniability, a ritual of touch that allowed us to say what we couldn't speak. It was a language of fear, but also of a deep, unconscious need. But the most important thing we ever learned was that no unspoken language, no matter how intimate, can sustain you forever. Sooner or later, you have to risk the words. You have to be brave enough to ask the question, to make the confession, to tear down the walls of your quiet, lonely rooms. You have to be willing to stand in the wreckage and start building something new, together, on a foundation of honesty. You have to learn that the most profound intimacy isn't found in the silence of what's unsaid, but in the peaceful, shared quiet that comes after everything has finally been spoken. It's in that quiet, that beautiful, honest quiet, that you finally find your way home.